Okay, it is 12:50, and so I resume the hearing. Let us go then to site H46.
Yes, site H46 takes us to New Earswick, and we have a site here in terms of how it's presented in the policy H1 and the table. It's shown as having no modifications in this table. You may recall that previously we had identified an increase in the capacity to 117 dwellings. What has happened is that on reviewing the matter statement submitted by Ms Dukes on behalf of the landowner, there was a query around the site area, and what we've looked at is the application. There is an application that's currently pending on that site, which is for 117 dwellings, which is where the original modification came from. But on closer inspection, the site area relating to the application includes land which is not part of the allocation. So the 104 is the indicative capacity as it relates to the application, excluding the properties that are shown on the part of the site that are not within the allocation boundary. So the bit that we're referring to specifically is immediately to the south of the site, and depending on which material you're looking at, it's shown as a small area that's got garages on at the moment. So that's actually excluded from the allocation site. It's not within the green belt, so doesn't raise any issues in that respect. But just in terms of qualifying the capacity as we've proposed, we're not seeking to adjust the allocation boundary to incorporate that land, but that's not to say that we wouldn't support the application as it's presented, which does include that area and brings that into the development proposal. With respect of the site area, the reference in the plan as submitted to 2.74 hectares was an error and related to an assumed developable area, because as you can see from some of the the satellite images, there is quite a strong and thick tree belt on the eastern boundary, which actually is part of an area that's designated on the policies map as an area of open space. So that the whole site area, as it relates to the allocation, is 4.9 hectares. And apologies on my behalf, I didn't correct that in the table when updating this, so we would just make that additional amendment. So as I say, with respect to the status of the site, it has got a planning application that's currently before the council. It is a greenfield site, but has no significant or constraints, certainly none that we consider to be showstoppers. It does have a greenbelt boundary, and in this case, we're considering the inner boundary. So the reference...
CYC 59D, and it's PDF page 64.
Yes, perhaps if you first go to PDF page 8 of that same reference, you'll be able to see the particular boundary in the context of the whole section that this particular annex deals with, and it is boundary 10 that we're concerned with on this site. And the boundary that has been defined relates entirely to the very prominent tree-lined path and the belt of mature trees that exists on that eastern and southern boundary, which we consider is...
My apologies, did you say tree-lined path?
I did, yes. Which then becomes a so that's on the southern side, and then as it as you look at the eastern boundary, that's where it becomes the tree belt. The path is on the southern side. Yes.
No, sorry, I didn't follow you at all there.
Oh, sorry.
Tell me about the path. Where does it go?
Apologies, just one moment when I bring up the... on the southern boundary, as it relates to the green belt, and then on the eastern side is the belt of trees. I think that's correct.
You've got a belt of trees, I think, on a north-south axis. Is that right?
So it's a tree-lined. So as you look at the satellite image, if that's what you're looking at the moment, it looks...
I'm not, if it helps. I'm actually using your statement appendix, which has extracts from EXCYC 59D.
Yes, yes, same one. Yes, so yes, so the path, as I understand it, is on the southern leg, and then as it goes northwards, it's...
Yeah, so if you turn back a page in the appendix, you'll see at the bottom the slightly more blown out, wider map, and you'll see at the footpath the dotted line running north-south at the very top towards the church. It turns west, meets the blue line, and then it turns south at that point. It's hidden once it hits the line, but that's where it goes.
All right.
Something to see on site, perhaps, but...
That's a public footpath, is it?
Yes, as far as I understand it is. I don't think at this stage we have anything further. Oh, sorry.
Just one thing on the land immediately to the south. So you'll have seen in some of the representations reference to that spur and why is it included. And I go back to the plan that I took you to, so it's PDF page 8 of our appendix, and you will see it sort of lick around down. Now, this plan is...
We're talking about the curvy sort of finger bit.
That's precisely that. So, yes. Once you look at CYC 59D page 8, the overview plan that Miss Bartle referred to, what you will see is that is the thin end of... I'm going to use a wedge, but it's the thin end of the gap that stretches down, and the assessment picked that up as being particularly important because of the separation of settlements and purpose for the preservation of the setting and special character of the historic town. The land to the east of the boundary is within the parish of New Urswick, and it contributes to the...
My apologies. Could you just elaborate on the separation point a little bit for me?
Yeah, well, so perhaps, could I ask you to turn up CYC 59D? I appreciate if you do it, so I promise I can do it in 1 minute and it'll be really obvious.
Yeah, it's just that it'll probably take my laptop, being as it is pins issued, about 10 minutes to open the document.
PDF page 8 within that document. I was going to say 1 to share might be sufficient, but... So you're page 8, inner boundary section 5, and the number 10 is the boundary that we are looking at, and that curved finger of land immediately to the south. So the gap I'm referring to is essentially as between the boundary formed by numbers 9, 10, 11 and 12 on the western side.
I'm sorry, which page?
Page 8, sir, PDF page 8.
I have it.
So hopefully, sir, once you see that, the gap is obvious, and that's what we're referring to. So, in the parish to the western side, New Urswick, its separation as between that and the boundary on the eastern side, numbers 14, 15, 16, 17, 19. And in our submission, thinking about the fourth Greenbelt purpose, that's an important separation to maintain.
So just remind me, which is the fourth Greenbelt purpose?
Preserve the setting of the historic city. And when we've undertaken our appraisal, in essence, all of our first criterion, compactness, and the third criterion, landscape and setting, all of those are engaged here because of its importance essentially at the tip of that gap. So council's submission is no change to the Greenbelt boundary from what is shown on that plan there. I hope that was quicker.
Yes. Grateful, thank you. Okay, well, I follow those points. Who's here to talk about this site? Mrs. Jukes.
Thank you, sir. Yes, my representation was mostly to do just making sure that the plan was up to date as far as possible. But I think the council has explained why the site on the south side has been excluded. It doesn't affect the ability to bring it forward for redevelopment. And yes, there's a boundary of green open space that actually incorporates more woodland than it does open space. But we've made best of as part of the application and excluded the woodland and just then focused on how we're going to provide the open space. We've ended up with slightly different numbers to what's in the local plan in terms of site areas, but it works. Now, just in terms of the green belt, and I would really encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, to actually visit this site, please, because wherever you stand along Willow Bank, all the way from the south, where there's some garage blocks, as you walk up Willow Bank, if you're looking northwards, you simply cannot see any open countryside beyond the slither. And what you see in the feeling as you're walking along is that you're part of an urban environment because you've got development on both sides of you in a corridor. And the narrowness of that opening at the northern end where Willow Bank takes a 90-degree bend between Chestnut Grove and Pollard Close on the other side of the River Foss, it's just so narrow. You stand there, you can turn around in a circle and you don't feel like you're anywhere near the open countryside. You feel like you're in an urban environment with development and it's just a nice, pleasant place to be, but certainly not part of the open countryside, because basically there's a bottle mouth at the top that's completely enclosed by woodland and that therefore sets the defensible boundary to where you might reasonably draw a greenbelt boundary, which is why we've asked if that slither might be excluded. If the council's concerned about it coming forward for development, then actually there's other means by which it would be protected from development. One being the greenbelt, the open space designation that's overlaid the greenbelt designation. So that in its own right is a policy means for controlling development, which I think is more appropriate than the greenbelt designation. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's probably my fault entirely, in which case, I apologise and do forgive me. Precisely what change are you putting forward or suggesting here, Mrs. Jukes, in relation to the boundary?
so that it excludes the green slither. So you have on the proposals map the southern side, the southern edge of H46, and instead of the green slither wrapping round, because this is it, you've got to the east of H46, you've got the open countryside that projects northwards, and actually my feeling is that it needs the green belt, instead of it then coming round H46 before it heads southwards in its hook, actually it stops on the southeast corner of H46 and then is cut. So it excludes the woodland. Or it could include the woodlands there. It needs to wrap around, what's this estate called? There's a little cul-de-sac.
Do you mean that the green belt boundary should sort of follow the eastern edge of the open space, the woodland area? Is that what you mean?
That would have been a simpler way of explaining it, yes, sir.
So
I'm just interested to know why.
Simply because in looking at the principles of Greenbelt, they're quite clear as to what the function is, and there's no purpose in terms of Greenbelt for including that hook and that slither within the extent of the Greenbelt.
So it's not because you want to build on it, but just because you think it's wrong?
Absolutely. Like I said, there are other policy designations that are more appropriate, and I feel that in this instance it's been used for the wrong purpose.
So two very short points. Firstly, the Greenbelt designation is the most effective spatial designation to achieve what Mrs. Jukes agrees with us should be the case on that land, namely to keep it open. Secondly, it's both the first, the third and the fourth Greenbelt purposes we say are engaged here. I can, if you wish, summarise it, but otherwise I'd simply ask you to read the analysis at PDF page 46 through to 48 in the document that you have open before you, which takes you through each of those purposes, and I can do no better than refer you to that. All three of those are engaged. This is important both on a local and more strategic level, and should be maintained as Greenbelt, not least because the modification that you're being asked to make, namely to substitute the Greenbelt designation for some other designation, isn't one that has a justification. We're told it's not going to be built on. So why change it?
Anything else from your side, Mrs. Jukes?
Sorry, just a point of clarification. I'm not asking for it to be substituted, a designation, Greenbelt designation to be substituted for anything else, just simply removed. Because the boundary would draw, it'd be white lands with an open space designation within the development limit.
Same answer, sir.
Okay, thank you. Unless there is anything else on H46, I'm going to move on. Okay, very good. Site H52 then.
Yes, H52 is a brownfield site that is also part of the council's housing delivery programme. It doesn't have any formal planning status, but there are pre-application submissions that are being or have been considered, and feasibility work is being undertaken to bring forward a scheme on that site. It doesn't have any greenbelt requirements, but there are no significant constraints that have been identified in the site's assessment process, and we have shown it to be deliverable within the 5-year period. Albeit later on in that period, given that work is only beginning in terms of the application process. And the capacity, as proposed in the plan, hasn't or isn't, we're not seeking to amend that. We know that some of the schemes that the council's housing team have been considering may be looking at higher density development, but that work's still underway, so at the moment we don't see it reasonable to change that. But as we've said consistently, that it's not a target that would be deliverable within the context of the policy should that occur.
Okay, is anyone here to talk about site H52? Just one question, I think, from me. When you say it's part of the council's housing delivery programme, does that mean it's land owned by the council?
Yeah. Yes, correct, yes.
And I should clarify that on instructions from what we said earlier. Some of the sites within the council's housing delivery programme are actually delivered by the council as well. So it's not exclusively third-party developers. The council will engage with some of the deliveries on some of the sites itself. And it has a track record of doing so. So it's slightly more mixed picture than what we portrayed earlier, but just to clarify that for you.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there anything else then on H52? Very good. I'll move then to H53.
H53 is a small site that has been identified in the village of Knapton. The capacity is, as proposed, at just 4 dwellings, which relates to work that the council was undertaking alongside some of the neighbourhood plan work that was ongoing. That neighbourhood plan is now adopted, and recognition that this infill site within the village was capable of being developed. The village itself is washed over greenbelt, so we're not concerned here with boundary treatments, with establishing or following boundaries. The justification for the greenbelts being washed over, or greenbelt designation washed over the village, is provided at EXCYC 59F. There is no formal planning status on the site, and we haven't had any indication that there is an immediate application due to be submitted. Though that said, the likelihood and the expectation from our conversations with the landowner is that the site owner would bring forward development once the local plan had been adopted, and we subsequently put the site's deliverability into the later phases of the 5-year supply on that basis.
So the rest of Knapton is washed over. Would this be the only land in Knapton then that wasn't in the green belt, or is this site also in effect washed over?
Don't worry, so I had the same thought as Ms Bartle went through it. So I've pulled up paragraph 89, of course, of the 2012 NPPF. Limited infilling in villages is potentially appropriate development. We're not dealing with brownfield land though, so it would be the penultimate bullet point. Limited infilling in villages and limited affordable housing for local community needs under policies set out in the local plan. So I think we would probably fall within that limited infilling in villages, because you have the comma, sorry, there's a sort of hypercritical scrutiny the courts deprecate, but I think the short point is limited infilling in villages, therefore it would be appropriate, notwithstanding the Greenbelt washover, which is there for essentially strategic reasons because of the nature of the village and its location.
Sorry, I wasn't, probably the heat getting to me, but I didn't follow your point.
The point is the fact that it's washed over isn't a difficulty because it would fall within the penultimate bullet point in NPPF 2012, paragraph 89.
So does this plan propose to both allocate the site and wash the land over? Does it say that?
That is how the plan is before you today, yes.
So just to be clear, let's take the scenario where the plan is adopted, application comes in before the council. The way the council approach that is by saying, well, it's an allocated site, it's limited infilling in the green belt, so it's not inappropriate. So nobody needs to demonstrate very special circumstances.
Yes, and I think that was the rationale for including such a small site in the allocation, whereas normally a site of that capacity would fall below and does fall below the methodology that we'd set out. So there was a reasonable basis for including it to ensure that there was that clarity from a decision-making point of view.
Yeah, so the principle is acceptable. You don't need to demonstrate VSC. And this is very distinct from an urban edge type scenario where you might have a dispute about whether you fall within the limited infilling exception. Here we say it's obvious you do.
Yeah. Am I missing something? I think you're telling me that the plan set does both those things. It allocates the site and washes it over. I'm not seeing that in the plan.
If you have the appendix to the council's matter statement, final page, final diagram,
Yeah, I have that. That's what I'm looking at, yeah.
yeah, that's the washover.
So it's green and orange.
It is, yes. It's sort of two on top of each other, I'm afraid, yeah.
Yeah, that's not very clear, is it?
No, I accept that.
I think the point here is that the plan just needs to be pretty darn clear about that point, rather than relying on a slightly different shade of orange.
Yeah. Well, so we will think about the best approach there, whether that's a different key on the map or whether that's some text. I have in mind some clarificatory text in the supporting text to policy H1 probably is the clearest point. We don't need to put it into policy, but we should probably insert a paragraph that would clarify it immediately below policy H1.
Yeah, or you could, perhaps a footnote or something like you've done with some of the others.
Absolutely, yes.
Needs to be clear, though, I think.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're unlikely to get too excited about how you do it, as long as you do it.
Understood. Yeah.
Okay, is anyone else here to talk about site H53? Okay, good. I will move on then to site H55.
Site H55 is a brownfield site and is another council-owned site which is currently leased out. We still expect the site to be disposed of and capable of being delivered. You'll perhaps have noted from our submitted matter statement at 8.3.4, where we recognised that we had included the site in the revised trajectory that we'd put forward. But actually on further interrogation, given the remaining timescale on the lease and the lead-in time for an application, that actually it should sit outside of the 5-year supply. It is a site of capacity of approximately 20 dwellings, so has no fundamental bearing on the position of the housing supply. It's simply moved on to take account of the position in terms of that lease, as I say. It remains developable within the plan period, and remains a suitable site that should be allocated for residential development. I just point to that error that was made there. With respect of how it's presented in the policy, the site area and estimated yield are unchanged as it stands at the moment.
Is the timing dictated by the lease?
It will indeed be, yes.
So what's the lease for? What will we see when we go on the site?
It's some employment units, small-scale employment units. I'm not 100% certain of the remaining timescale of the lease, but I could perhaps get that information if that was required.
I suspect that won't be necessary. I might regret asking this, but has the loss of employment on that site been taken into account in your employment figures?
I will check that for you, sir.
Do you have any idea what, I mean, you know, it's a site for 20 homes. I'm just wondering what sort of scale of employment we've got here, and I'm guessing it's reasonably small scale.
I was going to say, it's very, very small scale. Yeah, the site itself is only 0.2 of a hectare, but we will indeed provide that for you.
So it shouldn't be something that will trouble us.
I certainly don't anticipate it doing so.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there anything else on H55? that we need to know? Okay, very good. Site H56 then.
H56 is proposed as a modification to be removed from the plan on the basis that that has now been completely developed out. That was recently completed. But yes, before the base date, prior to April, 1st of April 2022.
Good. Are you indicating there, Mr. Richwood? Please.
Thank you, sir. There's a number of points that I want to raise about H56. A lot of it's sort of de facto done because they've approved a planning permission. We're here. You've said you can't do anything about that.
Not seeing as it's been built, no.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would point out is that the planning permission, this land is located within a green wedge. It's part, the H56 allocation is part of a green wedge, and the development is part of H56, so it leaves a substantial area of open space left, of which there's other open space that is not part of H56 that should still be considered in that contiguous that space. Now that open space is shown on the draft local plan, the 2005 draft local plan. It incorrectly doesn't show it as greenbelt, but it does show it as open space. So you can see the area of that, and it's referenced within the Heslington Village design statement as being a green wedge that prevents coalescence of Heslington. Now we've heard from other villages about the importance of preventing coalescence with those villages. Now, a lot of these villages have got quite hefty areas of land between them, but Heslington has the university inside of Heslington. It's the University of Heslington, not the University of York, effectively. It's inside Heslington. It makes up a big deal of the boundary between the Heslington and the York area. And then there's this wedge as well that was previously owned by York St John University, and the way that the Greenbelt boundary previously, the Greenbelt boundary in the 1995 Greenbelt local plan, which is also the same Greenbelt boundary as in the policies of the 2005 plan, because the boundary they've drawn on the proposals map is wrong. It's not justified, and it's not in accordance with the policies of that plan. So there's only one true boundary up to this date, and that's the boundary in the 1995 post-modification Greenbelt local plan. And that should be our starting point, really, along with the fact that we know that this land is in a green wedge. Now, I appreciate that some of the green wedge has been lost now due to inappropriate development that didn't treat it as being in a green wedge, didn't apply Greenbelt policy to it, didn't prove very special circumstances, and is too late to do anything about because it's built. But I don't necessarily think that that should be the reason why this is automatically removed. I also want to point out as well, I mean, the council has crossed through here, so I assume the council's, in fact, they just said that they're planning on removing this as an allocation. But in actual fact, it never was an allocation, it was simply a mistake. The council has told us that the allocations are assessed against the site selection methodology, and therefore an allocation has a meaning. An allocation is a site that's been assessed against the site selection methodology and passed. This site was assessed against the methodology and failed, but the council put it back in anyway and refused to remove it. And the very same reason that they're now removing it, they told me was the reason it had to be in when I took them through the 3-stage complaints procedure, which, by the way, they told me was only a 2-stage complaints procedure, and the 3rd stage was just an internal, but that's by the by. Basically, they just refused to deal with it and said it had to be in because it had a planning permission, and now they say it has to be out because it had a planning permission. It was never in to start with because it was never, it was assessed against the site selection methodology and failed. It's in a green wedge. It should be protecting the rural character of it, and this prevents York from merging with Heslington and Heslington merging from York. It's now getting quite narrow because the university is there, And I did want to speak on the university section about a section of the edge of the university that I think should also, be kept, because it, that I'd put that in the
I don't want to stray into talking about the University of York, because you'll know that we have a York University Day coming up in phase 4, and it wouldn't be fair to other parties who aren't here today.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so the only thing I want to get in there is that perhaps what I think is that by treating this as an allocation, albeit one that they've removed now, is missing the point. Because I think, yes, there's a development, and not all developments are allocations, so there's no reason why it has to be an allocation. The site's been assessed against the methodology and shouldn't be an allocation. Fine, they're removing it. Fine, it's got some development. Let's look at it at some stage in a holistic way, including what we know about the other land around it, and decide where the greenbelt boundary should be. And now, land that prevents coalescence, every bit of that land, every square centimetre prevents coalescence. So if some of it is lost due to inappropriate development, it doesn't diminish the meaning of the other. That must still serve a purpose. So although it's getting less and less, if it goes to 0, then York and Heslington merge, and then you have to deal with the fact that there isn't any separation between those areas, and the plan actually does treat there as being a separation because they're separate areas. So it's the whole thing's been handled wrongly. It should never have been an allocation. They put it in as an allocation so that it could then go to the planning permission, and like Councillor Waters told you earlier, they then told the councillors, well, it's an allocation, just approve it. It was never treated as greenbelt. It was never very special circumstances were not established, but that's all by the by. It's happened, and there's nothing you can do about it. But what I think does need to be done in the local plan is to put aside the fact that it's an allocation and just look at the area starting off from where the current greenbelt boundary is in the 1995 plan, and see what's left of it, what purpose that serves to keep in. And the other thing I would just like to mention is that when it became apparent that the council was not going to treat this land as greenbelt, the community got together. Now, they're not a parished area, but they formed a group, and they got a petition, and they petitioned the council, and they asked them to allocate this land as local green space in the plan. The council didn't do that, and it was called in by the local councillor to the scrutiny committee, and it was then supposed to be passed to the local plan working group to make the decision, but they just submitted the plan. It was never dealt with. So at the moment, as far as I can say, the only thing that this is close to being an allocation for is local green space, because it's not been decided if it shouldn't be. Thank you.
Okay, so clearly it's been built. In terms of the local plan, are you proposing any particular change to the plan?
Well, I mean, I guess the change that I'm proposing is very similar to the change that the council themselves are wanting to make, that this site should not be an allocation. Now, they're saying it's removed. I'm saying it was never an allocation in the first place, but it shouldn't be an allocation, and therefore it shouldn't be something that's discussed through the allocations, if you like. It should simply be windfall development that's taken place, and at some stage when we look at where the boundary should be, that should be when this is, unless it's an allocation, unless you make the decision that it should be local green space, in which case it's an allocation for local green space.
Sorry, did you say that on the plan it should be identified as local green space?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one possibility. I think that it is quite a difficult problem for you now, because the options that you'll ultimately have is, do we exclude all of this land from the greenbelt? Do we continue to include all of it in the greenbelt, or do we include some of it? Now, if you're including it in the greenbelt, there isn't really much point having it as local green space. The reason why the community wanted it as local green space was because the council wasn't treating it as greenbelt. But obviously, if an inspector in an adopted plan has said it's greenbelt, then they'll have to do that in future. Now, whether or not that gives you some flexibility as to saying, well, some of the area should be naturally in the green belt, but the other bit could be protected as local green space so that it doesn't affect where the boundary exactly should be.
So sorry, I'm not sure I'm following. Do forgive my slowness. When you say it should be local green space, or maybe it should be green belt or whatever, are you talking about the same land that is proposed for allocation in the plan, but that has in fact been now developed?
Okay, so what's happened with this site is that they put it forward as a much larger allocation. So they put it forward as a much larger allocation. So it's the same area, but they said they were going to get loads more houses on it. And then when it actually started going through the planning process, it was clear that they would never get that number of houses on because the whole area is surrounded by a bank of mature trees that is protected. And so they couldn't get past that. And the whole site was playing pitches, which Sport England objected to the loss. And there was a deal with the local sports centre that they could use one of them. And ultimately, they had to agree to keep some open space, I think they've designated as children's play area, as part of the planning application. So, you know, I'm not sure the exact percentage. I think it was about 51% developed, 49% not. Or something round about there. So there's a good portion of the land that's in this H56 designation that hasn't been built on and can't be built on because of other reasons. And what worries me is that by putting this in as an allocation, they're effectively saying the whole area shouldn't be considered. I know they're removing the allocation now, but if there's any decision about greenbelt boundaries from the fact that it was an allocation, then that's not being considered. And I think that the remaining open space within H56, as well as open space that's outside of H56 but in the green wedge, still is within a green wedge. It still fulfills greenbelt purpose, the fourth purpose of greenbelt, and amongst others. And like any land that fulfills greenbelt purpose is land that should be allocated as green belts, in accordance with MPPF section 48, section 80.
Okay, thank you for that. I understand now.
Thank you.
Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, sir. I must say we were struggling a little bit to understand what the ask was, but as I understand it, it is to make this developed site green belts.
I think that Mr. Wedgwood is referring to those bits that haven't been built, that are, it seems, open areas, and that they should, in effect, be protected either through being identified as greenbelt or perhaps as being identified as open space. Is that right, Mr. Wedgwood?
Yeah, so the either as greenbelt or the local green space designation rather than open space, because open space doesn't really help much in York because they just bulldozer right over it.
Looking at the proposed policies map, see, I've done the policies map.
We've talked about that, Mr. Griffiths.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologise. There's the green wedge that you're talking about runs east-west. Am I understanding that correctly? And parts of that green wedge are designated on the map as public open space. They've got that sort of cross-hatching on. So what I think you're suggesting is that might extend, that designation might extend into the site, so it's read as a whole. So some of the green wedge, at least, is retained. Am I understanding that right?
I didn't quite get your reference to the diagram, but I think, generally speaking, yes, I think some of it should be... What is open space now should not be treated as not protected because of the development that's occurred.
I didn't quite follow the point about the green belt, because looking at the map, it's not intended to be designated as green belt as far as I can see.
Oh no, they don't intend to designate it as Greenbelt, but they should. The point is that in the 1995 Greenbelt Local Plan, the Greenbelt boundary goes along one side of this site, and it includes this, this area. And the 2005 Draft Local Plan, the Greenbelt boundary in that plan, in accordance with the policies, is the same as the 1995 plan, but the boundary that they've drawn on the proposals map is wrong. And it's the boundary that boundary on the proposals map has caused a lot of problems, because they've removed land from the Greenbelt on the basis of that, which rests upon the 2003 Greenbelt appraisal, which the multiple planning inspectors have found should not be used to remove any land from the Greenbelt. But that's exactly what they've done. They've removed some land on the proposals map on the boundary they've drawn on the basis of the 2003 Greenbelt appraisal, which isn't justified. And we know that they're removing the land in the Green Wedge. And the Green Wedge is supplementary planning guidance. Supplementary planning guidance can only be approved if it's in accordance with the plan that it's being approved with. And therefore, we know that in accordance with the policies of the 2005 Draft Local Plan with the 4 set of changes, this land is in the Greenbelt. So the proposal now is that the current local plan wishes to remove it, and therefore the current local plan should justify it.
So it's not a question of adding or removing from the Greenbelt. We're undertaking a boundary setting exercise, and I'm not going to repeat everything you've heard about the nature of that exercise from Mr. Elvin and Mr. Linus. So I don't accept that as the prism through which we need to be looking at this site. When one looks at the policies map, and I know you have it open, it is instructive as to the distance from that land which is shown as Greenbelt. There is, in my suspicion, no tenable basis for designating some parts of a developed site some distance from that boundary as Greenbelt. As to the open space designation, we would need to assess that. I mean, as we sit here today, we have reservations about that. It's a developed site. There will inevitably be open spaces, amenity and the like. One expects that, whether it's an urban area and open space or simply an urban area. At the minute, we certainly wouldn't agree to that as a modification. All we could do, and I'm happy to do this, is to take it away, look at that, and we will put in a note as to whether we accept that would be an appropriate modification to make that open space. But if you pushed me on it today, the answer is no, it's not. But given this is a new point, I'm willing to be flexible and to look at it and come back to you in writing, but no more than that.
I think it was perhaps Mr. Griffiths and I, more me, that was talking about open space. Mr. Wedgwood was talking more along the lines of local green space. That's certainly what he said in his hearing statement.
Well, I think the same answer would apply. If you push us to say no, we wouldn't accept it as that. It's a developed site. Yes, there may be some areas within that are undeveloped, but that's because they are part and parcel of every developed site, which has amenity spaces, it has parking spaces, it has turning spaces, it has all those bits that just because it doesn't have a house on it or dwelling on it, we won't protect and don't consider it appropriate to protect such small areas there, so in a manner which is disjointed in some distance from the Greenbelt and the other areas that you see on the policies map that are designated. It's just not appropriate to do that, and there is no clear justification either. What is the threat that's been identified? Where is the evidence, the analysis to show you that that needs to be protected? We don't see any of it. We don't think it is justified.
Across the plan area, you have looked, I think, haven't you, undertaken an open space assessment and identified areas of land which the council considers performs an open space function, and where it does, identified it as such on the policies map with an associated policy seeking, in the first instance at least, to protect it from development. Here, I guess, the situation's been slightly different, rather, because very possibly, I mean, I don't know what the timescale was, but the site was actually probably being built on at the time, so there was nothing there to assess at that point. Would that...
Correct, yes, yes.
So is there the possibility then that we do have within this site land that might perform an open space function, which had it existed at the time that you undertook the work, you might have identified it as such? I mean, you know, we haven't been here, we don't know what it's like, so I'm looking to you to help us out a bit.
Quite, it's possible. We'd have to have a look at it and see if it was necessary to reconsider it in the context of the assessment that had already been undertaken.
But does the plan's policy on open space and protecting open space rely on that space being identified on the policies map, or does it relate to any land which performs an open space function, irrespective of whether it's shown as open space on the policies map?
That's a helpful question. The policy itself...
Thank you very much, Ms. Barker.
The policy itself does not make that, or doesn't require that specifically. The explanatory text makes clear that there are designated areas on the policies map, but that's not set out in the policy itself. So it could therefore be that it would be capable of widening out to undefined and other areas that are open space which have not been identified on the map, perhaps.
Yeah, okay, I think what I'm going to do is stop that discussion right there, not least of all because I'm leaving that to Mr. Griffiths to deal with. Or am I here for that? I can't remember. But yeah, Mr. Griffiths is going to deal with the, in effect, development management policies in the plan. But I would suspect that there are other areas of land not shown on the policies map that do have an open space function, or the council would consider to have an open space function. And so I would suggest the council might want to consider that in the lead up to the phase 4 hearings.
So that's fine. We've heard the point made today. There will be another opportunity to go over this in the way you've indicated. We'll consider this in the run-up to that opportunity, and insofar as it's necessary, address it further then. Just to make sure, Mr. Wedgwood, did you follow that? Do you understand what I'm banging on about?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that just to address something that Mr. Henderson said there about it not being near the greenbelt, that's not been established yet. That's really what the purpose of this plan is. It is near the greenbelt as far as the last hearings were in 1995, and about the plan there, that was the plan that got the furthest way through. So if they want to take that out, they have to justify it. Now, maybe they can justify it, maybe they can't, but they have to do it. And that's the process of this plan. Now, I mean, I guess that as far as this particular hearing, this today, the only thing that I really want to achieve today is to make sure that that is not dealt with as an allocation, and therefore its greenbelt boundary is not decided as an allocation, and it comes up for further discussion at a later date. Because I kind of feel a little bit hamstrung because I can't mention the university stuff, and that does sort of would be a response to, you know, Mr. Henderson's point. So I think that if that's still open, if they're going to go away and do some work on open spaces and stuff, then maybe it's something appropriate to discuss at a later stage of the hearing when that information is available. Thank you.
Yeah, I think probably the bottom line is that the council does not consider that any land within that site should be identified as greenbelt. And they're not, I'm pretty sure, they're not going to change their minds about that, which, you know, is usual in local plan hearings. We don't expect people to go away having agreed. What the council, though, is potentially saying is that it might be that there is land within this site that performs an open space function. And that being so, the council would want to ensure that it is protected under open space policy, and that to make sure that it does, the council is going to potentially look at the wording of the policy. Now, the open space policy will be discussed in phase 4 hearings. The point being here is that, yes, the policies map shows some areas as open space, but it doesn't show all of them. That there are other potentially, smaller parcels that are, they perform open space functions. So the council's intention, I think, is to make sure that those parcels, those areas that aren't shown as open space on the policies map, are given the same level of policy protection as those that are. Or at least that's what the council's going to consider in the run-up to the phase 4 hearings.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, and it's a start. It's not really what I think should be. I do think,
I know that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it should be in the green belt, because if it's open space and it's within a green wedge that protects the rural character of the village of Heslington, it fulfills the 4th purpose of Greenbelt in NPPF section 80, which is the most important purpose of Greenbelt in York. So,
yeah, no, I understand your argument on that. I mean, I'd say the council won't agree. Obviously, we're going to consider that.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I appreciate that you're going to try and give it some protection, but I do think that the wider question as to whether it's Greenbelt it's being belittled in a way, because we're looking only at this and then only at the little bit of land in there the part of that land that's still open. It's not looking at the land in the wider green wedge, and in fact in the land on the adjacent university campus, which we can't discuss today. So I think all of those things need to be surfaced before we can really have a full discussion about whether this should be in the green belt. I don't think it's something that can be rounded off today, because I've put in arguments in relation to that, and I know they can't be heard yet because of other disagreements and stuff, but they are relevant to this, because it means that other land would be in the green belt as well that's next to this land, and there's reasons for that. So I think that from today, if they go away and come up with their open space stuff, then that's great. But I think they should bring that back, and then at a later date, there should be a discussion around the green belt, because the green belt's the only thing that protects land in York. The council really just runs roughshod over other designations. And it's presently in the green belt. It's presently shown as green belt on that previous plan. So I'm not, it's obviously a question for you, for this plan, to determine where the boundaries should be. But I don't think we can have a fully informed discussion about it until all of these arguments have been surfaced in relation to land that's around about that area. And yes, if the council goes and does some more work and then brings it back, I think that would be useful. But I just think if this is not an allocation at all, then it's windfall development that's occurred, and the actual position of the Greenbelt boundary would be something that I think is discussed later, isn't it? It's whether that section of the boundary is correct.
Well, so can I summarise it as I understand it from our position? Mr Wedgwood wants this to be Greenbelt. He's not asking for any other designation. That's the designation he wants. We will go away in respect of open space and check the point that you have made, but we won't go any further, because that's simply going to be abortive work in light of what we've heard from Mr Wedgwood. If and insofar as he wishes to persist with the argument that this should be Greenbelt, we don't agree, but phase 4 we have a session on inner boundaries, and that's the place to have that discussion, and unless you say differently, so that's essentially where we're going to leave it for today.
No, that is right. That is the place to discuss it. Yeah.
I'm grateful.
Can I just say, I don't agree with one point you said about summing up what I'm saying, that it's the only designation, because I did mention local green space, but the local green space is secondary. If it's green belt, it doesn't need to be local green space, but I haven't said that it shouldn't be local green space. But I do agree with your final point that we should have this discussion at a later date in the section 4 about where the boundaries should be. I just, you know, unless you decide it's local green space, in which case it's local green space, I think that's the right place to have it once all these other issues have been surfaced. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I would just say look out for the timetable on phase 4 hearings. Okay. Site H58.
Yes. Site H58 is another of the council's sites in its housing delivery programme. It is or has recently been subject to member approval for part of the wider site that it's related to. So this is, apologies, this is a section of former junior school site which has a number of former school buildings on it. The wider site was subject to member approval for redevelopment of a library hub, of which this particular part that we're seeking allocation would come forward as part of the disposal process for sale. And the capacity of the site has been updated, and we're proposing a modification to reduce it to 15, and that's simply on the basis of the work that the council's been undertaking on feasibility associated with that wider project. And the council is looking to dispose of the site to a registered provider later this year. Probably worth pointing out that education use ceased back in 2014, so and the requirement for the Secretary of State consent for its disposal and appropriation or change expires later this month. So that's not an issue that is concerning us. Brownfield site, but no significant constraints to delivery as far as we're aware. We have included it within our 5-year supply, again at the later end of the 5 years, given the lead-in with the planning permission required. There is no planning permission on the site at the moment, but a scheme would be, or is being prepared.
I think I heard you say that for disposals we're a registered provider. Is that, are we talking about affordable housing?
Yes, so it would be an affordable housing site.
100% affordable housing?
To my understanding, yes. Again, we would be able to provide confirmation of that through the trajectory work, the request for you to, that you asked for us to look at that.
Is that a requirement of the plan?
No, sir, it's not. It's on the basis that this is a council-owned site and is tied up with, as I've implied, the wider use of the site associated with the school and what it's being brought forward for currently.
Is anyone here to talk about H58? Okay, we don't have any further questions on that, or indeed on any other sites. So unless the council or anyone else has anything else, I'll adjourn for the day. Okay, good. Yeah, just to clarify, I don't know if this has got on the examination web page yet, but we've agreed to open slightly later tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
Mr. Bewley is very grateful.
Excellent. Okay, in which case then I make it 2 o'clock. I adjourn the hearing to resume tomorrow morning at 10. Thank you.